Okay, in this chapter we're going to talk about forecasting. Forecasting is very important because we've made quite a bit of mention about supply concepts, and in that process we've alluded to the demand concept as well. Well, the trick, successful planning, is to balance your supply and demand so that you don't wind up either with too much inventory, which we've said is a cost and a waste, or too little, which means you're going to lose business if you don't have the product or service there when the customer needs it. So forecasting has traditionally been the technique that you use to try to balance that. The concept of forecasting has really not changed over a 30 or 40 year period, but some of the techniques have certainly been improved, and with the use of computer and more information, they've certainly been had more impact on results than ever before. But we're going to take a little time in this chapter to talk about types of forecasting and how to develop forecasting methods and systems. The framework is you forecast the demand in order to identify how much output you need from your operations. And what you have to recognize is I've never seen in all my career an accurate forecast, so there will always be a variance or a deviation. As we said in earlier chapters, the trick is to stay within an acceptable range of deviation, so you minimize some of the costs that will be involved. Forecasting is what we think will happen. Planning is getting to a more specific set of actions that try to implement what we want to happen. You forecast so that you can determine whether you have the capacity to meet that demand, and if you don't, you have to make some decisions about how to carry inventory in order to satisfy the demand. What happens if you don't satisfy the demand? Your customer goes to your competitor and you lose the business. Qualitative forecasting is based on judgment where there's a lack of data. That's kind of a shoot from the hip type of thing. There are different techniques, however, that you can use, things that we know as Delphi techniques, life cycle analogies, market surveys, and other judgments that are not precise sciences. What you do is you make a decision based on the best information you have. Time series forecasting, on the other hand, tries to translate data into periods or buckets of time so that you can get more precise on a month-by-month basis usually, and avoid the fluctuations that are caused by seasonality and other factors. It involves a lot more data that goes into the calculations, and the data has to be made relevant so that you can identify it. Many businesses that are seasonal in nature, such as the retail industry, depends in some cases almost the 1 month of December either makes or breaks many companies for the year. And if they don't have a good December, they're going to lose money for the year. That's why seasonality and trend forecasting become important to some businesses. We're going to talk about different types of forecastings in the chapter. One of the common ways is exponential smoothing. It's a way of trying to eliminate the variations that are not predictable because, for instance, 1 month, let's take weather. There's no way of saying that, okay, it rained in November last year, so therefore it will rain exactly the same time in November and this year. And in fact, that did not happen. It rained a lot earlier. We were caught by surprise. But the Weather Bureau does do a lot of forecasting, and they may be off in terms of buckets of time, but they're trends, and that's another type of forecasting, trend forecasting, probably are relatively accurate, and they can basically tell you, well, we know we're still going to have rain within a certain season or a certain amount of time. There are different calculations in this chapter that you'll be working with as far as maybe some case applications and problems that you'll get. They're not necessarily things you have to memorize so much as understand how to use them, and you can always reference the formulas or any applications. Forecast error are important. As I said, probably the most common type of error is the timing error. It's the one that says, based on history, you think everything's going to happen the same way in October. And that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but for weather reasons or other reasons, it might happen in November instead. And it's that type of thing. Within a trend analysis, it'll still show up, and your variation will just be a more minor one. Sometimes forecast errors may be more significant than that, and when that happens, you have to look at the assumptions you make, because in forecasting, it's the assumptions that determine exactly what your level of preciseness is going to be. Different types of tools that you'll read about in this book. One of the very common ones is the mean absolute deviation, or MAD, which tries to measure deviation in absolute units. And what it's measuring is a range of deviation that's allowable. And if you go outside that range, it says, it's not acceptable. There are tracking techniques. There's other types of errors and deviation. Interesting thing from a technology point of view, more and more systems now are learning how to track some of their data and send out signals. In the past, the old-fashioned way was to track the data, then analyze it. And a lot of times the analysis was a human analysis rather than a computer calculation, and then go to another complicated step of adjusting and setting a new trend. Well, now with electronic controls, and we have tracking signals that repeatedly show up. Well, this isn't really going the way you planned it. Here's what the new trend is. Here's where you're going to be off if you stay on course, or what you need to do to adjust your course. And it gets translated into time series types of applications. There are things like the Bob Judkins method and several others that are well used in terms of application. You have to look at the industry, the type of business you're in, to determine which forecasting method works best for you. Just keep in mind that some systems are time series and others are causal models. A causal model forces you to look at what are the things that are the cause of the issues and be a little analytical of that. The example in this PowerPoint is if you're looking at newspaper sales, you may have to look at population size and even shifts in population and even shifts in trends of what people like, or even their use of newspapers versus other electronic media. You'll see examples of the different time series and exponential smoothing models, and some of you may not like to get into the statistical part of calculation, but it is necessary to understand how it works. You don't have to be whizzes or experts in this field to understand it. Okay, how do you select a forecast method? As I said, the most important thing is to look at your own business, your own industry, get an idea of what the variables are important to that industry, then look at the respective software or models that are involved here and see just which ones match up the best. And sometimes you might want one that's more complex because of the type of industry you're in, but a lot of times you don't want to do that. You may want to simplify it, because the truth is that most people that look and use this data are not that sophisticated. You want to look at things like horizons. For instance, how far out do I need to look to forecast? That's determined by the lead time your particular business calls for. And then how accurate do you have to be? Again, you have to look and see how, if I'm in the spacecraft business, have to be very accurate. If I'm in a retail business, probably I can afford to be off a little bit. Okay. And finally, we're ending up here emphasizing the synergy of the planning, forecasting, and what it's used for, which is basically replenishment. The important thing here is you want to know as timely as possible when you have to replenish things in your inventory, so that you don't carry it any longer than you have to in your inventory, but you have it there when you need it, so you don't hold up production or shipment to the customer.